you for coming for this TC Wimodeg webinar. I'm excited to see so many of your names on the participant list. I hope someday we will be able to meet in person again, and I have a feeling that is coming soonish. So in the meantime, we have this webinar series to make sure that we are connecting and learning throughout our time here together. I am going to introduce Jacquelyn, but before I do, I wanted to just push you guys to think as you are watching this presentation or afterwards, if you with your organizations have something that you would like to share similar with this, whether it's a case study or a program that you would like to highlight, feel free to contact Emily and I. It's always good to share what each other is doing, and I know that we usually have our networking opportunities to do that, but in this COVID situation, if you guys want to potentially spotlight your work that you're doing through a webinar, please let us know, because this is a really good way for us to keep in contact and share what each organization is up to. So think about that. Today, we have a really great talk lined up. So Jacquelyn Bacigalupi from the DNR is here to share a little bit about the FIBI program that the DNR is operating. Jacquelyn received her Bachelor's of Science and her Master's in Conservation Biology through the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. She has worked for the DNR in some shape and form for the past 18 years. And since 2011, she's been in charge of the FIBI program. And so she's here to share a little bit about the program itself and how it operates and what we can learn from it and from her. So Jacquelyn, I want to welcome you, and feel free to go ahead and share your screen. Throughout her talk, if you guys want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand. And at this point, I'm assuming people know how to do that, but just in case, up at the top of the screen, there's a little smiley face with a hand on their forehead. That's where you can thumbs up, you can heart, you can applaud, you can smile. And most importantly, that's where you can raise your hand. So feel free to do that. Also, if you'd like to put questions in the chat throughout the conversation, that's also an option. Emily and I will be monitoring both for hands and chats. So again, just to say, if you guys want to practice, if everyone wants to go ahead and get the applause icons going, we can welcome Jacquelyn and her presentation. Go ahead, Jacquelyn.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to assume you can hear me and see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I'm Jacquelyn Bacigalupi, and then I just want to acknowledge that in our FIBI program, we have a couple vacancies right now, so we're a little bit shorter staffed, but right now we have Derek Barr, Lucas Borgstrom, and Aaron Sunmark as well. And we work for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, but we work really closely in this program with several staff from the Pollution Control Agency as well. And my email's at the bottom of this screen. So I'm going to assume that most folks are kind of familiar with assessment, given the group you're associated with. But so all the different ways that we kind of monitor and assess the quality of our lakes and streams in Minnesota and the biological standards and water quality standards. So the FIBI is, of course, just one piece of the puzzle when we're looking at the health of lakes. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, but keeping in mind that, of course, there's lots of other components to the health of lakes and streams. And so conceptually, IBIs have been around for decades now, looking at biological integrity, and they were originally developed for streams, looking at the fish communities in streams. And then we are the first state to implement using FIBIs in lakes to assess the biological integrity and the whether a lake is adhering to the aquatic life use standards. So conceptually, and in reality too, we have more sensitive species and tolerant species in lakes that have lower disturbance within the watershed and on the shoreline. And then you have a gradient, and the fish communities change as the disturbance within the watershed and on the shorelines change. And of course, everything's more complex than that, but that's kind of it in a nutshell. So The IBIs are evaluating human impacts to the health of systems, and a fish IBI, ours and many other fish IBIs that have been developed, are composed of multiple metrics. So like when you're talking about a metric, you might say the number of intolerant species, or the number of insectivores, or the proportion of insectivores, or the proportion of tolerant biomass, et cetera. So those are the types of things that you kind of combine all your metrics together to get an overall picture of the health of the lake or of the system you're measuring. And the metrics, when they were selected within the fish IBI, needed to correspond to in a predictable fashion, such that as you would have, for instance, worse or higher shoreline development or higher watershed development, you would see higher numbers of tolerant species and lower numbers of intolerant species. So we have a paper if you're really interested in this stuff. So I'm not going to go through the nuts and the bolts of how we built our fish IBIs, but I'll just mention that if you go to our website, at the bottom of it, there's a link to a paper that was published in Ecological Indicators that will go through the whole long process of, grouping our lakes, classifying our fish species, developing metrics, how they're scored, the different tools that we have, and then the threshold development, repeatability, confidence intervals, all that kind of stuff. But just some of the more commonly, I guess, things that people wonder about. For the fish IBI sampling, we use 4 gears. So we're using beach seining, which is the top left picture, and then backpack electrofishing, which is the bottom left picture, that are primarily sampling kind of a lot of non-game species in the near shore, many of the small benthic and intolerant and vegetation loving species. And then in the top right corner is a trap net. That's an overnight set. And that's often sampling fish that are using the like larger bodied fish that are using the littoral area, bullheads, different species of sunfish, bowfin, carp, et cetera, often picked up there. And then in the bottom right are a couple guys pulling up a gill net in the rain. And so that's sampling more top carnivores, walleye, northern pike, et cetera. So we have 4 fish IBIs. When we developed our fish IBI, we had 600 lakes that had been used. And so the different IBIs were developed based on a hierarchical cluster analysis of kind of the morphological features of lakes. So we were kind of trying to lump lakes together based on their size, depth, shoreline development index. By that, I mean not how much shore was developed, but by was it a complex or a simple shoreline, percent littoral, growing degree days, all sorts of factors that we threw in there. And then we had the fish IBIs have different numbers of metrics, but there are across the different IBIs, there's 16 types of metrics that are looking at kind of structural habitat and then water quality habitat. I told my kid he had to stay outside, but he's making all sorts of rackets. I'm sorry if you can hear him like running the hose and banging things in the garage. So in any event, we have different metrics that are responding to different types of habitat in lakes and the disturbance that then would impact those habitats. And so to get a fish IBI score, we take our raw data. So in the top right here, this is just an example of a survey where we caught, our nearshore data, our gillnet data, and our trapnet data. You'll notice that the nearshore is in number of individuals caught. When we built our fish IBIs, we looked at for the different types of metric performance, and for the gillnet and the trapnet metrics, they perform better looking at biomass versus that number of individuals. And then in this case, these are the different metrics that are used in this particular fish IBI, which is used for lakes that have complex shorelines and a deep water. And then, so the fish IBI score here is 77, which is pretty high. And then the impairment threshold is 45. So this is well above a general impairment threshold. And so this lake, we would say, is fully supporting its aquatic life use based on the fish IBI. And just if there's questions, I can't see the hands while I have this in this presentation mode. So just totally interrupt me as you wish. All right, and so then I mentioned that we had to, so not only do we have to kind of come up with scores, we have to ground them in some sort of, what is an impairment. And so we did that using a similar type of model that had been used all over the world, the biological condition gradient model, to develop biocriteria. And so we worked with Tetra Tech and Midwest Center for Biological Diversity and a private consultant and others to develop biological condition gradient models and kind of describe what happens in the fish community as you go from a level 1, which would be kind of like completely pristine, no human impact. And then level 2, you're maybe seeing slight changes. Level 3, you're losing a handful of intolerant species. And, by the time you get to level 5, the wheels are pretty much off the bus and the fish community looks pretty bad. Your balance, not only have you lost most of your sensitive species, but your composition, your balance is quite off. And so, as has been used for streams in Minnesota, we used VCG level 4, the median level 4, as our general impairment threshold. And then I'm going to talk a little bit later about, so I think I saw that Will Bichard had talked about TALU for streams, which is great. And that, is their exceptional use categorization for streams. We've also developed an exceptional use framework, a TALU for lakes. And we are working with Will Bichard and then others at PCA to implement that as well. But we have to get the rules through all the hoops that they need to jump through. So this is just an example I pulled out from an old assessment in the Mississippi Brainerd watershed. And so when we collect data for about 6 years within a watershed. And so we might have, one survey in rare instances. Usually we have 2, 3, usually we have 2. Sometimes we have 3 or 4 or more surveys that we are looking at. So this is showing just the, each dash down here is a lake. And then it shows like the range of scores. So I think you guys can probably see my cursor. So like this one would have a pretty wide range of scores from, maybe 46 to 60. And some of these would have, much tighter range of scores. And so we can look at whether a lake is supporting its aquatic life use, but things get really fuzzy sometimes. So like, I'm hoping you guys can kind of see the gray here, where we have like lakes that score right around the impairment threshold or right around an exceptional use. And so when it's right around that impairment threshold, we, rather than saying it's not supporting or it's fully supporting, we usually would call that inconclusive and vulnerable to future impairment. And as we implement the exceptional use category, we're going to have to, we're going to have to make sure, we are starting to collect multiple surveys to try to make the best determination there. But if a lake is right on this bubble, it's probably going to land in this general use standard versus the exceptional.
Jacquelyn, just to let you know, we can see your cursor and all the things. So thank you.
Okay, awesome. So we've been assessing watersheds since 2015. So we've gotten through 33 watersheds in Minnesota. And the map on the left is just the colorful, if you're kind of interested in any particular watersheds, where we're at in the process with those. So some of them have been, 33 have been assessed. We've sampled over 1,000 lakes so far. So lots of watersheds. We have a lot of data on. I'm going to talk about the Mississippi Twin Cities, given that this is a Twin Cities group, towards the end of this, to kind of just give you a sense of the data that we have in that watershed so far and the lakes we plan to assess. And then as we assess watersheds, we find impairments and then lakes that are vulnerable to impairment. And so for those lakes, we conduct stressor identification investigations and generate reports. So some of them in this burgundy color. Oh, wait. I'm sorry. In this dark blue and burgundy cover, those ones, the stressor IDs are completed or in some cases near completion. So, how are the lakes looking that we have assessed so far? On the left-hand side of this graphic is just the percentage of lakes that have been assessed as fully supporting based on the Fish IBI. So the clear pattern in that in northern Minnesota, where the land use is primarily, wetlands and forests, we have 3/4 or more of the lakes that have been assessed as fully supporting. And then as you get into central Minnesota, still over half, but we start to see more impairments. And then down in southern Minnesota, unfortunately, most of the lakes that we've assessed have been impaired based on the Fish IBI. Because we don't have the TALU for lakes and the exceptional use as an official categorization yet, we often will say they have exceptionally high Fish IBI scores, but it's not an official category. So in this case, we have, some lakes in northern Minnesota, but we haven't identified lakes in southern Minnesota yet. And then anything that's gray, like kind of the light gray, those are watersheds that have not been assessed yet. So this is for lakes that have been assessed to date, kind of taking a look at some of the stressors that seem like they're driving the ship here. So in the top left, if we look at the total phosphorus, and so across each of these graphics, on the left are lakes that are identified as exceptional, and then in the middle, fully supporting, and then on the right of each graphic are the not supporting lakes, and then the A, B, C just indicate if there's a statistically significant difference. So in all cases there is. So this would demonstrate that lakes that have been identified as exceptional have significantly lower phosphorus than lakes that are fully supporting, and fully supporting lower than lakes that are not supporting. Similarly, exceptional lakes have higher aquatic plant species richness. They have lower watershed development and higher shoreline habitat quality. The shoreline habitat quality is a score the shore score, which is kind of a survey type that we use that tries to look at deviations from kind of natural conditions. So we're scoring the aquatic and the shoreline zones based on, has there been removal of vegetation? Have there been introduction of unnatural type structures? So, there's like good news, bad news. In general, if you're going to look at the state as a whole, and in my job, I get to talk to a lot of other states that are working on similar work. Minnesota lakes are, generally, pretty healthy. We're, it's not a lost cause. When you talk to other states, they are, they're quite envious in a lot of cases of Minnesota lakes. The impaired lakes that we have identified are most often in agricultural and urban areas, and typically they are nutrient impaired, although it's not like a one-to-one, they're not always the same lakes. The fish are going to be a little bit more complex. They might respond on different time windows. There might be connectivity issues where if a lake had been nutrient impaired and then now it's no longer nutrient impaired, the fish just don't like instantly respond. And if there's no connections, species that are lost might be lost forever. Exceptional lakes that we've identified are nearly all in forested areas. Although there's a handful that are kind of really neat situations where they are holding on in, highly disturbed landscapes. And it's usually a lake that's quite deep, has complex habitat, and the fish are managing to do really well despite the stressors that they're influencing. So those are really neat, resilient lakes. Exceptional lakes tend to have the diverse plant community and high quality shoreline habitat, as I mentioned. And as we've done our stressor ID reporting, eutrophication and physical habitat alteration are most commonly the stressors, but there's a lot of other things that are important. Connectivity can be important. There's a lot of unknown impacts. We're starting to get some information about, maybe potential changes to fish communities with zebra mussels, with shifting nutrient balance in the littoral area. Pesticide application is another big question mark. Climate change. We have some really good information on changes we're seeing in our Cisco and other cold water fish communities, but it's a lot of questions. It's not a neat, tidy answer. So I mentioned additional standards earlier. So we're working on a couple different packages, and one of them is I've mentioned several times throughout this presentation, which was a higher threshold for exceptional lakes, but we also are identifying lakes that support cold water fish species and working with PCA to put together the technical support documents, and then it will go out for public review. Standards that would provide additional protections for lakes that support cold water fish, including Cisco, lake whitefish, and lake trout. Currently, there are some standards for lake trout and stream trout lakes. So we're adding on to those. We're evaluating those existing standards and then adding on. So I just wanted to pull up some of the, I know you guys are kind of work in the metro, and some of these watersheds are on the periphery. I wasn't sure, I guess, on what how wide a scope you had. So I just threw up some that kind of touch different parts of the metro. So on the left, this is the Rum River watershed, and this was our very first year of assessment way back when. And so most of the lakes in this watershed were assessed as fully supporting. There were a handful of vulnerable lakes and a handful of impairments that were identified as well. And then on the right-hand side of this graphic, this is the Mississippi Sartell. Oh, I thought I didn't have labels, but it's labeled up in the top. Mississippi Sartell. So the very bottom of this is kind of coming into the, I don't know if that's what you guys consider metro or not, but Stearns County area. And so again, most of the lakes were fully supporting and a handful of impairments. And so then, and sorry for the different maps, I kind of pulled them from different reports, so the styles change as we go here over time. But on the left-hand side of this were assessments completed in the Minnesota River Shakopee watershed. And so here you're getting right into the heart of the metro. So you have, parts of Eden Prairie and parts of Prior Lake, and then rural Scott County and Carver County. And then this is the SOC. So this would be, a little bit north of the Twin Cities. So both of these watersheds had quite a bit of impairment. In one case, you're looking at a lot of urban development, and then the other case, we're looking at more agricultural type land use. And then I debated if I should show these because we are right in these have not been out for public comment or what have you yet. On the left-hand side, I have Mississippi St. Cloud. So we just recently had the professional judgment group meeting for the Mississippi St. Cloud. So I guess these have been shown publicly. And these are, quite a interesting range here. We have one lake that's exceptional, Sugar Lake. And so this is in kind of in Wright County up into Stearns County. And then a lot of fully supporting, but a lot of vulnerable lakes and impairments. And so this watershed, Josh Kanopik, who's going to be starting to work a little bit more with our program in July. he will be working on a stressor identification for this particular watershed. And then on the right-hand side, this is the Lower St. Croix. And I believe they are having their watershed assessment team meeting tomorrow. And then the professional judgment group meeting is in June 20 something or another. So these are really have not been fully vetted yet in that, you know, they're very draft determinations, but based on our professional review of the data, you know, we have quite a few, as you can see in the red are the impairments, but still several lakes that are fully supporting, and a couple kind of high profile lakes that surprised us, I guess. Big Marine in particular did not score as well as we might have expected, given that it still has quite a bit of nice habitat in the metro. And so that one was determined to be vulnerable to future impairment. But that will be further discussed at the professional judgment group meeting. So in the Mississippi Twin Cities, this is a watershed that we are finishing our data collection this summer. So we have, I think there's 6 lakes that we are getting to. In all cases, these have at least one survey, and we're collecting additional survey data on them. So these are the lakes that we are planning to assess. I just listed them out by county within the Mississippi Twin Cities. And so PCA has scheduled the assessment in this watershed for next winter and spring, and then there will be the public comment, you know, after that. So I know that in the metro area, it's been really neat to see, you know, there's a lot of active watershed districts and local units of government and consultants that can bring a lot of interesting, a lot of like valuable information beyond the fish IBI data that we're bringing. So it's always kind of fun to participate in watersheds where there's just a lot of information. The Mississippi St. Cloud, I mentioned, I just went to that PJG last week, and it was just really remarkable to hear about the different, there was, you know, some very active people with the watershed district and with the Soil and Water Sherburne County Soil and Water Conservation District that, you know, had tons of good information that's really helpful to us as we're trying to figure out making sure that our data is good, and then identify the stressors that are impacting the lakes. So we look forward to continuing to work with partners. And then I imagine that some of you are involved in RAPs and One Watershed, One Plan, et cetera. So there's a lot of good prioritization type information. You know, fish IBI information, like I mentioned, is just kind of one piece of the puzzle, can be used with phosphorus sensitivity, aquatic plant diversity, other types of prioritization exercises. The work that we do in Stressor ID hopefully is useful in helping for vulnerable lakes and impaired lakes, prioritizing what, you know, might be some actions for protection and restoration. You know, I would argue the vulnerable lakes often are kind of the lower hanging fruit in that they're not impaired. So, you know, they should be priorities for protection. And then I mentioned exceptional and cold water fish communities should be priorities for protection. There are a handful of lakes that are in the metro that have, you know, kind of that flirted right around that exceptional, but they just weren't quite there. So maybe we had, so for instance, Lake Elmo has scores that are really high, but not quite at that exceptional. White Bear Lake. You know, those still, in our mind, coming from the fish community perspective, you know, should be really high priorities for protecting their kind of unique resources in the metro area for sure. So where to find fish IBI information? All of our fish IBI information should be on Minnesota DNR Lake Finder. There's also, I don't know if anyone's familiar, if you guys are familiar with the Fishes of Minnesota Mapper, where you can kind of look at all the species that have been found and by whatever unit you want, lake, watershed, et cetera. And then our fish IBI scores are available on the MnGeo or on the Watershed Health Assessment Framework. I think that's what I have a picture of here. So the blue are ones that are above impairment threshold, red are below, and purple are exceptional. And those are just displaying like our most recent scores. But the MnGeo will display all the scores. I take it back. It displays the most recent, but if you go into the attribute tables, it has all the scores. We are working on a layer that shows our assessment decisions. So now that we've assessed 600 and some lakes, seems like we should get that information a little easier. And it's also available on the PCA website. And then our stressor identification reports are available on the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So if you go to their watershed page here, looks like I'm on the otter tail. So it has stressor identification for lakes on top and then for streams on bottom. And then, as I mentioned, we have a publication that's available. If you go to our website, it's probably the easiest way to find it. You can get all the information you would want about the Fish IBI and Fish IBI development. Our website's kind of convoluted, but if you just Google Fish IBI for Minnesota lakes, you'll find us. And right now we have a couple vacancies. So there's a couple watersheds that are kind of orphaned, but these are the watersheds that each one of us that Derek, Luke, Aaron, and I are working in terms of Fish IBI at the moment. And we will be having a couple folks from our Division of Eco Waters helping us temporarily until we can fill our vacancies starting in July. Oh, I guess that. All right, so I guess I can take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. We do have one question in the chat. Actually, a couple of questions in the chat. So I don't know if you can see those or not.
Let me try to see them. For some reason it says this meeting chat is muted.
So I can go ahead and ask the first one if that will help you.
Yeah.
So Matt Koshin wants to know, have the Drake and I don't know how to pronounce the last name. I'm sorry. Yep, metrics changed or evolved since they were first developed, or are they pretty consistently applied since they were first developed?
So the Drake and Pereira Fish IBI was developed back in the 1990s and early 2000s, and they worked on lakes that were 100 to 500 acres, kind of in central Minnesota. It was a small set of similar lakes, and they developed 16 metrics and a scoring system based on kind of those set of lakes. But as we sampled more lakes, the lakes are pretty different. So for instance, as you would sample like a lot of larger lakes than they had sampled, we saw much more diverse fish communities. As we sampled shallower lakes than they were looking at, we see much less diverse fish communities. So you have, so each of our fish IBIs that we developed has some metrics that are similar to the Drake and Pereira metrics, but the metrics were selected based on if they showed significant relationships with the set of lakes that we were developing IBIs for. And then the scoring was developed based on what an expectation is. So for instance, if you had, for our 4 fish IBIs, I'll just contrast like our shallow lakes with our deepest complex lakes. You have really different expectations for the number of insectivore species that you might have. Where in the shallow lakes, maybe you're, kind of like a decent score, you might have 4 or 5. And then in a deep complex lake, the expectation might be more like 10. So conceptually, it's a lot of the same ideas, but the scoring and the tools are quite different. And I worked, and Missy, formerly Missy Drake, now Melissa Tremmel, she was involved in our Fish IBI development all along the way. So I worked very closely with her and then with Dave Staples, our fisheries biometrician, as we developed the Fish IBI tools. So that kind of was really a treat to have her along, kind of for that continuity.
Absolutely. The next question, have you seen any connections to aquatic invasive species and IBIs?
That's a really good question. I think that's one that's going to take some time to see. We have started to look at if we are we've looked at it in a couple different ways. So one is we've looked at it like specific to aquatic plants. So in general, lakes, there's not a relationship, just because a lake has Eurasian water milfoil or has curly leaf pondweed. But as you get lower plant diversity, which often happens when curly leaf pondweed or Eurasian water milfoil kind of take over a lake, then we do see lower fish IBI scores. But in lakes where they're present, but they're not really having a structural change to the plant community, we don't pick up any differences. And then we've started to try to tease apart some of the zebra mussel connections, and I just think it's a little too early to see anything. But in theory, there's several papers that have been looking at kind of like isotope signatures of trophic changes that are happening in lakes as zebra mussels are potentially changing, the energy flow. And so, like theoretically we might see some changes, but it's just not, we're not there yet.
All right. Emily, I don't know if you want to ask your question or.
Yeah, sorry, I can't for some reason.
Sure. We're happy to ask them.
Okay.
And I actually have two. Actually, my first one, you keep mentioning you have some open positions. Are those posted? If they were, we could post them to our forum if there's any open positions currently.
Unfortunately, with the statewide hiring freeze, we have not been able to fill any of our positions.
What a bummer. Well, keep us in mind if the hiring freeze goes away, because we do have a forum, and it's a good way to get the word out to a whole bunch of folks in this community. My other question is, wait, I lost it. Is it possible for local fish survey data done by, watersheds or counties to be incorporated into your FIBI calculations?
Yeah, so we have a pretty rigid protocol because we're using, like you can't have the same expectations if you're not using the same number of stations and the same gear and the same time of year. So we do have a really strict protocol. We have had one kind of watershed district that contracted with a consulting agency to collect some fish IBI data. And we do have that data, and we did, kind of work back and forth with them. I helped them get, voucher results. So when we collect our fish species, for instance, we're verifying them with a lab to make sure we're not goofing up any of the ID for some of those tricky species. And then we got the scoring. So we do incorporate that information, but we wouldn't make an assessment decision strictly on outside information. We've made the decision that at this point, maybe in the future, if we repeat a bunch of surveys and we're getting the same information, we're not there yet. Like we haven't repeated to make sure that we're kind of doing the same things.
So that makes sense. And I won't speak for some of the folks on this call. People should feel free to write in or comment, but I do know that a lot of the watersheds and counties in this area have a lot of resources, and I think would like to be able to have their information that they collect counted in some way. So I think keep that in mind, and if you guys are more open to that in the future, we'd love to have you reach out to us to have more discussions about how data could be used. We're having those conversations about MIBIs for streams right now, and I think it would be similar for lakes and fish.
Yeah, we are strapped super thin. So I would love, if other people have resources to collect data, we would like to have that information. I'm like non-committal, I guess, on precisely when it comes to assessment time, how that would work. The other thing would be, potentially teaming up. If we stay this short-staffed, we'll be looking for anyone we can get too. But so we did, for instance, last year with COVID, and then with also I had 8 fewer people in my program. We got about a third of the work that we normally would get done. and worked, those of us that were working way more hours. But and this year looks a little bit better, but it'll still be a lower survey volume.
Okay. The next question is from Amy, and she wants to know how fish stocking affects IBI surveys.
Oh, it's funny. I had those slides ready to go because I usually get that question. I should just show it when I'm let's see. So we did look at that. Both. Well, let me unhide it. Well, in any event, so both Missy Drake, now Missy Tremmel, looked at that. Can you see? You can see my screen again.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And we looked at it. This is just, we looked at it a number of different ways, but this is just kind of showing, like, we looked at, with individual metrics, with overfish IBI, do we see changes with fish stocking? And so, these are just kind of showing if you have no stocking versus fry versus fingerling versus both, do we see differences? It's super complex because we stock, most lakes are only stocked with walleye, but almost like so many lakes are stocked with walleye, and the types of lakes that are not are different from the types that are. So it's really hard to tease apart. But I guess, we did not find strong relationships. So IBI score is in the bottom middle here. Looking at fish IBI and looking at individual metrics, we didn't. I just kind of, for fun, in this case, I was looking at, in the bottom right, it's walleye per gill net. So there was a difference, obviously, in the number of walleye per gill net with no stocking versus stocking. But in most cases, you had northern pike there with a no stocking. And so for our metrics, you don't need to have walleye. They don't penalize you, but they don't really help you. They're just, they're lumped in with any top carnivore. So it was really hard to tease apart. We did not find any big relationships. However, that's not to say that on an individual lake basis, there couldn't be. So if you had a lake that was particularly stocked heavy, as like sometimes we do experimental things, I wouldn't say you could never impact the prey community, but usually we're stocking at a level that's not impacting the rest of the fish community. And similarly for muskies, those are stocked at such low rates, you're not going to be impacting, kind of your overall species richness or your overall dense biomass. And then we do a little bit of other stocking, and that's where it gets a little bit trickier. So, I'll just mention a couple. I don't know if you guys have heard about like Conrad Schmidt's project where he is stocking non-game fish into lakes. So he works in many metro lakes where Conrad is a former DNR biologist who's retired. And so he's working under permits with DNR, and he works on lakes that had documented extirpations of some non-game intolerant fish species, vegetation dwelling on lakes that used to have poor water quality, but due to the efforts of local watershed districts and the local communities have improved the water quality and improved the habitat conditions in the lake. So of course that's pretty complicated then, right? When we're going out and doing a fish IBI, undoubtedly there's that influence of the stocking. And so those are kind of handled on a case-by-case basis with us, in that we know that, the fish IBI tools are not perfect. They're subject to, management actions such as that. But I don't think predator stocking probably has much of an impact.
Cool. And then I guess the last question in the chat, and again, I want to welcome people to feel free to raise your hand and also ask your own questions. But Justine's question is, what is the regulatory framework for addressing fisheries impairments in lakes where excess nutrients are not a stressor or do not exceed state standards? Would there be a TMDL or a RAPS developed specifically for the non-nutrient stressors like shoreline impacts or aquatic invasive species?
This is a great question, Justine, and one that we've been talking about since we started doing these assessments in 2015. And so the regulatory framework doesn't really exist when you don't have a nutrient stressor. So if you're identifying that on, whatever, I'll just choose a generic long lake, that it's the shoreline habitat that's impacting the fish community and it's not excess eutrophication, there's not a mechanism to write a TMDL to say we need more and better shoreline habitat. So then it's really more falling as a voluntary, as a recommendation that can be forwarded in watershed or in one water. No, I can't. What am I doing here? One watershed, one plan. There we go. By if local grant programs. So I know, for instance, again, I just mentioned a couple times I was on that Mississippi St. Cloud PJG meeting and several of the local partners there. We have several lakes in that watershed where the water quality looks fine, but they are really, really heavily developed and the fish IBIs are not looking very good. Big Lake, Mitchell Lake would be examples. You guys probably drive by them on Highway 10 or you drive by Big Lake. And so in that case, the folks with the watershed are interested in kind of getting the message out and trying to promote more natural plantings, less riprap type. So it's not regulatory really. It's it's kind of a prioritization and relying on partners to help the message that not only are you going to help your pollinators, you can help your fish species too by having a natural shoreline.
Nice. Again, I want to open it up if anyone has any questions. We'll give some time for hands to raise or questions to be formulated. And while you guys are thinking of that, I am going to first off thank Jacquelyn very much. It was an awesome presentation. And if anyone missed it or has a coworker who wanted to come and watch, but unfortunately had a conflict, we will be posting this recording on our TCU MODAG website. So feel free to point people in that direction. And then the other reminder is if there is a project or a program that you'd like to spotlight in one of these webinars, again, feel free to email either Emily or I, and we can help make that happen.
Tom Langer has a question.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jacquelyn, for presenting. Question I have is, I think one of the bigger challenges that I face is how to relate the IBI to more specific, say, capital projects or projects that can be implemented. In other words, how do you tease apart a specific IBI score to something that can be planned and then implemented on the landscape that has a predictable outcome on the IBI? And I don't know if you have any general thoughts around that, I guess.
A little bit, biology is messy. And so, it's always going to be tricky to say it's a necessarily, we're never going to have a guaranteed outcome to any project that we do. But, given that we have pretty good correlations between, I like to kind of tease apart the IBI. So we have all these metrics. It's a lot easier to kind of think about, okay, well, if I have really low scores for small benthic species and vegetation dwelling species, I probably have, a need for some actual habitat in the water, natural habitat in the water, coarse woody habitat, plants, less grooming of shorelines. If I have like a imbalance more kind of in the insectivores and intolerant species, then it's probably more of a water quality type issue. And then anything that's going to improve the water quality, so whether, there's a stormwater control, you know, whatever kind of inputs that have been identified, you know, you're going to see changes in the fish community. The tricky thing is it's not going to be, you know, overnight with the fish community, and then the connected waters are going to be drivers. So it's a lot more predictable on lakes. You know, if you have a lake that's connected to a nicer lake, if you improve the habitat on the one lake, you know, that the species will find their way into and use that new habitat. Whereas if you don't, then your expectations are never going to, you know, maybe you're never going to get that exceptional score. Your goal is just going to have to be to get it above an impairment threshold, because you don't need a lot of species to get above the impairment threshold, but you just need to have like a balance, like where you're not having an overabundance of tolerant species.
Yeah, no,
so I think it's like those kind of general conceptual, but there's, you know, I can't say like if you do X, Y, and Z, your fish IBI score is going to be 51 next time. It's just a little more messy than that.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, I think that's hitting on a lot of the thoughts and conversations swirling and in trying to parse some of that out and some of the differences of, I guess it, in some ways stated, it's like if you get to choose between a water quality project where you can implement a project and it reduces phosphorus by X pounds compared to a fisheries project or something that's intended to benefit the biotic community, is there little metrics or little tidbits that can help us go into that and understand where we might see some of that? And you were hinting at some of that with looking at certain metrics in that. I think part of the challenge, like as a smaller organization, we don't have the robust data sets to really see some of these relationships. So curious if any of that has been published or again, might point us that, hey, this is a water quality problem, or hey, this is too many shoreline developments, or yeah, that's that sort of thing. So I think you're right in line with, I guess, where my question was intending to go.
Yeah, and so I was going to pull this slide up again, you know, so just you would see that pretty much any lake that we've sampled that has a phosphorus lower than, you know, 40 has been fully supporting. So if you're looking for like numeric goals of like, well, what do I need the phosphorus level to be to probably be fully supporting? You know, it you know, probably needs to be, you know, ideally, I mean, really, if you're below 25, you know, A+, you know, your fish IBI is going to be just fine, but that's not a reasonable goal for a lot of lakes. So, you know, so we can kind of look at like lakes that have been assessed, what are the phosphorus levels? And then similarly, you know, a little bit with like, with aquatic plant richness, you know, any lake that has 20 or more aquatic plants has usually been fully supporting. And those ones that are not, I can't say this is like every lake, but the specific ones I've been involved with for stressor ID, it's usually like one tiny portion of the lake has plants, but the rest of it doesn't have any plants, like one little bay, and then the rest of it's kind of a turbid system. So those are the, I mean, so those are kind of like benchmark goals, I guess, you know, to say, well, that's, you know, we're finding that lakes that have this are fully supporting. And then the stressor IDs that we are writing are identifying, you know, so we recently published, we have like 5 that have just been recently finished in the last 6 months here. And many of them, it was not water quality in all the lakes. You know, so I know like in the Ottertail, for instance, there was several that were pointing to shoreline development. And so we're kind of looking at the difference in lakes that, you know, close by lakes that do have a lot of intolerant species in the shoreline, and then the lakes that don't, and the intensive shoreline development. But it's super tricky because you have things like the natural condition of the shoreline is a factor as well. So if a lake just naturally has a really big littoral zone with tons of plants, you know, the lakeshore owners, even if they're super ambitious and trying to make it look like, you know, pristine and swimming pool, you know, there's can't. And then other lakes that have a steeper shoreline and have, you know, don't have as much natural habitat, the actions of a lakeshore owner are going to be way more impactful on those types of lakes. And that's the type of lake that we see the intolerant species just kind of disappear more easily. There was a study that was completed also, it was a cumulative effects study. So they looked at when you have lakes that only have, where the watershed disturbance is low and the water quality is good. And so really the only like big stressor is the shoreline development. What do you know, like, what is the level where you start to see changes in the fish community and in the plant community and in the woody habitat available? And I don't want to I think I know the number, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'm not going to throw it out, but it's right. Well, I'll just say it's right around like 10 docks per kilometer, which is similar to with our fish IBI metrics, where we start to see the metrics kind of tank out, is that 10 docks per kilometer. But again, every lake is different. So that's a general rule of thumb, but it's going to depend on the character of the lake. And that study, if you're interested, was completed by Donna Dustin, who was with DNR, and then Bruce Rendrachik with the University of Minnesota. He's retired. They're both retired now, and some of Bruce's grad students.
Fantastic. I do want to be mindful of time. I know that we are over, but I also want to acknowledge that there are 2 more questions in the chat. So Jacquelyn, if you have the time to answer them, we
Sure.
can definitely stay on. But if not, I also don't want to keep everyone here if you have some place to go. So
I'm
I
good. I can answer them.
Okay,
But
cool. Can you see the chat, or do you need?
I can see it now. I think it was,
Okay.
for some reason, it was muted at first on my end. I probably did something. Okay, so the question from Justine are, any thoughts on common carp? Does it appear the presence of large numbers can drive the fish IBI score down? Yes. So when we see a large biomass of carp, it is, we tend to see lower fish IBI scores, and the mechanism is likely the changes in the plant community associated with high numbers of carp. But I will say, in many, many cases, you know, carp are present in systems without having impacts. So like I'm in Brainerd, you know, most of the lakes up here, many of them have carp. They're not in such a high enough abundance that they're causing any sort of real problem. But I also worked in Mankato, where it was and I worked in Eden Prairie, you know, where it was a different story. So it kind of depends on if you have a shallow lake or a deep lake and what the carp community is. And then, were there unique characteristics of the few urban lakes with high fish IBI scores? Yeah, so generally they were, I mean, deep, when you can get a deep lake, it can absorb a lot more abuse. It's just going to be a lot more resilient. So like Lake Almo, I mentioned White Bear Lake, Forest Lake has a pretty reasonable score. There's probably others that I'm forgetting, but and then Forest Lake and, you know, White Bear Lake, those are big lakes. White Bear has a lot of, you know, different types of habitat. I haven't been out on Forest, so I can't comment on that one. But so it's just kind of resilient lakes that are holding on. And we see the same thing outside of the metro. So like Lake Carlos would be an example, and this is not fish IBI, but Lake Carlos is a lake where if you're out there, it's heavily, heavily developed. It's on the Alexandria chain of lakes, and it's not one where, you know, you would expect cold water fish, but it's just so darn deep that it's like one of the highest. When we have a lot of information on Cisco abundance, and, you know, it supports tons of cold water habitat just because it's so deep. So it can just take way more abuse than a shallow lake can.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for spending time with us. I know
Sure.
I learned a lot. I'm sure others did as well. And so I think if you guys want to practice the applause one more time, I think Jacquelyn definitely deserves it. So, awesome. Well, thank you. And then, guys, like I said, this will be posted on the website, so feel free to direct anyone else to it. And just keep your eyes on the inbox. Emily and I are trying to develop more content for webinars while we are currently remote. And then hopefully we will have an in-person event either at the end of this year or starting the next. We'll figure that part out. So thank you very much, and thank you, Jacquelyn, for spending time with us.
Thanks for having me. And
All right.
anyone, feel free to email questions too.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a good day, you guys.